This is lecture English 385-38. Review part 2. All right, let's get to it. So in my last review lecture, we talked a lot about terms, about all of the different terms that we have been using all term. And as I'm sure you witnessed, that was some dry stuff. Going through all these terms. Yes, of course, because when you learn these terms on their own, it's pretty dry. That's why we've been spending the last 6 weeks together applying each of the concepts that underlie these terms, questioning the concepts that underlie these terms, so that we develop the ability to use them, weave them together, and use them as ways not to memorize facts or memorize definitions that will immediately leave our head, but rather to apply different tools that allow us to break apart, analyze, and defamiliarize the idea of the history of the English language in all of its texture and variety. Anyway, I hope that that is how you are interacting with these terms. I hope that my dry review, term by term by term, has not superseded the position in your mind of how those terms are only meaningful to the degree that they are useful. And indeed, that's where I want them to remain, and that is what I'll primarily be testing you on in the upcoming take-home test. Not can you rattle off what each term means. Again, this is a take-home, so you can refer to whatever you need to, but rather, can you use these ideas, the ideas that the terms represent? But ours is a course in the history of the English language, and so much of our conversation has been not only about terms and concepts, but of course, dates. The earliest of those dates, for the purposes of our course at least, being the first Anglo-Saxon settlement in circa 449. Now, as you know, Smith and Kim and other teachers of HEL, the history of the English language, go back even farther to discuss how the language that those Anglo-Saxon settlers how that language developed, that those settlers, those sort of unwelcome settlers, got talking that way in the first place, that Germanic variety that they were speaking. But for the purpose of our strictly 1500-year history of the English language class, let's call this date our date of onset, the date at which the Germanic-speaking Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, all of these folks from what is now modern Germany and Holland, come into and settle somewhat unwelcome on the island of Britannia that is then occupied by Celtic-speaking peoples. This is the beginning of the language we now call English. It takes some time from there to settle into Christianization of these Anglo-Saxon peoples, as these Germanic-speaking, now what we might call very Old English-speaking, early Old English-speaking settlers start to spread themselves out across the island of Britain and through their military might to marginalize Celtic-speaking peoples to the various corners around what is now known as England, or the various borderlands, better to say. In 597, they become enough of a presence in their own right as a permanent people, the Anglophone, the people who speak the languages that will become known, or the varieties that will become known as English, right? Become a major enough group of people that Pope Gregory sees it fit to send missionaries to convert the land of the Angles, etc., frequently known as now Angloland. Right. This is the second major spike in Latin influence on the language in Britain. 597 represents a spike in Latin borrowing in Old English. The first, by the way, would be the Christianization of the Celtic peoples that came before. And indeed, Nicholas Howe, whom you've read, goes over what the experience was of Gildas, who was one of the Christianized Celtic peoples, upon witnessing these non-Christian Germanic speakers coming in to move his people to the margins of the land quite violently. It's interesting to draw parallels, as Nicholas Howe does, between Gildas, who's writing at the onset of invasions of the Angles and Saxons, the non-Christian Angles and Saxons, and Wulfstan, who is writing as the non-Christian or sort of partially Christian Vikings are coming in to now displace the now Christianized Anglo-Saxons. But in short, the important date being 597, which marks sort of the end of the darkened, sort of unknown, incomplete period of early English history that Nicholas Howe talks about. So, moving from 597, we're actually going in forward order. Isn't it amazing? Chronological order, right? Sometime after that, almost a century after that, we have circa 670. We have the composition, as witnessed by Bede, around the year 670, of Caedmon's hymn. It's pretty reliable that Caedmon is, if he was indeed real, which he probably was, indeed living under the guidance of Abbess Hild, and being a poet, or emerging as a poet at this point, and writing or rather orating his famous hymn. The question that Kevin Kiernan asks is whether the hymn that we have extant, the one that survives, is the one that Caedmon himself composed, or rather whether it is a translation of a translation into Latin of that English poem that has been lost. But that lost English poem seems to have been composed around 670. It is surely not the earliest poem ever composed in English, but it is the earliest poem that we know of which we have documentary evidence of any kind composed in English. From there, jumping forward even further, the raid at Lindisfarne at 793, and yes, indeed, this map I have been using does, when it can, position on the map when something can be localized to a certain place. So yes, the Caedmon's hymn entry is positioned near Whitby, which is the abbey where we believe Caedmon to have lived, if we believe Bede's report of that. Whereas the sack of Lindisfarne, the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, is indeed right on the map where Lindisfarne is. You're welcome very much. But anyway, the important thing about the 793 raid on Lindisfarne is that it initiates what we might call the age of Viking raids into England. Now, Vikings had been raiding England prior to 793, but the raids pick up in frequency afterward, and also 793 is a watershed moment because Lindisfarne is in many ways so important. It's an important monastery. And we have witness of what happened there in chronicle form. So the raiding of Lindisfarne is an important watershed moment, not because that particular raid affected the language, but because it is representative of 2 centuries of Viking incursions into England that went on in the 9th and 10th century, the 800s and 900s, which changed the shape of the language in permanent ways. One of the most permanent ways that it changes England itself is that all of those Viking incursions, because they tend to come from the east and the northeast, right, end up establishing an area of permanent Scandinavian settlement in England, right? Indeed, by the time of the Danelaw, that is what King Alfred sets up as a negotiation in the year, in the year 878, right? In the year 878, when King Alfred sets up the Danelaw, that is allowing officially the Scandinavian settlers to establish permanent residences in over a third of the area inhabited by English speakers. Keep that in mind, right? That's no small deal. This is a big chunk of the land we now know as England, of Britain. And at this point we have invaders who speak not English but Scandinavian languages, setting up permanent settlements in what is called the Danelaw across more than a third of the area that is inhabited by English speakers otherwise. That's incredibly important. And not only because of this, but this is sort of representative of it. We went over it already. Because even down to the form of the pronouns we now use, the idea that we say third-person plurals and sometimes an unspecified gender or non-gendered singular pronoun for they, them, their comes to us via the Old Norse-speaking, the Scandinavian-speaking invaders. That much contested use of the non-gendered singular they, by the way, the idea that they can refer to a singular human rather than just a plural, is in place as early as Middle English, if not earlier. We have it witnessed as early as Middle English, right? But the words they, them, their in the first place as a lexical innovation come in the Old English English period via Old Norse invaders. That's why in Middle English we recognize it as part of a recognizably northern morphology. Elsewhere outside of the north of England, we're still using hia, hira, him rather than they, their, them for plural third-person pronouns. All right. Anyway, what about that Danelaw, right? You see, I perk up when I talk about dates. This is the part I like. The terms, but no, I like the terms too, but I love this. I love this sort of, well, the history, right? 878 is the year that Danelaw, right, that border of what is officially a Scandinavian holding on the island of Britain, or Scandinavian speakers holding on the island of Britain, that becomes official after 878. And that's an important move that is taken by the then reigning king of Wessex, right, the westernmost kingdom of the 7 kingdoms of English speakers, then known, or now known as the Heptarchy, right? There are 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, right, known as the Heptarchy. The westernmost one is Wessex, which is reigned over by King Alfred, and it is in this period under King Alfred's great leadership that Wessex truly becomes the dominant one of those kingdoms, not only because it is one of the ones that is not taken over by the Danelaw, but also because King Alfred, in negotiating with the Danes, partly driven by his own military might and holding his own against the Scandinavians, right? Where he says, yes, you can have, right, as we might say here, yes, Scandinavian speakers, you can have a third of what is now England. You can have all of East Anglia, all of Essex, and half of Northumbria and Mercia, right? Those are kingdoms that are not technically his to give, but they are kingdoms that have been overrun. And Alfred says, we'll let you have those as long as you stay there, and will fight you if you don't. And that creates a kind of negotiation that positions Alfred, the leader of Wessex, as the leader of any subsequent efforts to consolidate what are still English holdings. In subsequent years, as Alfred's descendants start pushing back on the Danelaw, start retaking parts of the old Heptarchy into what we might call Anglalond, the speakers of England, or land held by the speakers of England, that means that all of those once disparate kingdoms become unified more under the leadership of Alfred's line in Wessex. At least for a time. What's important here too is that because Alfred is a friend of literacy, because he encourages increased literacy both in Latin and in the vernacular, and you should know what that means, both in Latin and in the vernacular, that plus Alfred's might is part of why the vast majority of Old English that we now have surviving is in the West Saxon variety of Old English. There were, of course, a great amount of variety and variation across the various locations, let alone the various kingdoms of Anglalond. But the one we have most clearly represented, particularly in literary texts, is the West Saxon variety, thanks to the leadership of Alfred and his descendants. A reminder, however, that the primacy of Wessex and of Alfred's descendants was not necessarily a permanent thing. Yes, it is the 937 Battle of Brunanburg, led by Alfred's grandson, King Athelstan, that really sets in the true idea of a unified England. It effectively, because it pushes back Scandinavians past even Northumbria, right? It pushes back those Scandinavians and thus effectively unites most of now what we now know as present-day England as one unified kingdom. It's thanks to Alfred, but it's enacted by his grandson Athelstan. And it remains so, really until 1016, right? Wessex dominant, Wessex ascendant, Alfred's line ascendant. Under that line, King Edgar sets off the Benedictine rule, which is a renewed interest not only in reforming English learning, but also in reforming the very shape of the church in England, which of course has been in England since 597. Under Edgar, his leadership and the leadership of others, particularly St. Benedict, the Benedictine rule marks a shift in the primacy of Latin learning and thus marks the third major spike in Latin influence on the language of Britain, that is, on Old English. So the first one is not on Old English. The first spike in Latin influence would be the Christianization of the Celts, the Celtic peoples. The second one would be the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons in 597. And the third one would be this moment: the Benedictine rule, the reorganization of various, including English, monastic or monastery situations, which represents the third major spike in Latin influence. Good for you, Edgar, but unfortunately, 1016 brings now a new ascendancy. It's at least unfortunate for Edgar. brings a new ascendancy of Scandinavians. In fact, because of various political reasons and various military reasons, King Canute is able to retake control or take control of England, and King Canute becomes King of England as well as of Denmark, thus, according to Smith and Kim, as they put it, allowing Canute and his sons from 1016 to 1042 to rule a Scandinavian empire. So we see here truly, right, a consolidation of the strong influence and indeed mutual influence of Old English and Scandinavian languages, or at least the earlier versions of those languages that we would call Old Norse. I hope I'm not speaking too quickly. I get excited about dates. I'll try to slow down. So that takes us to 1042. The line of Wessex restored under Edward the Confessor, a famously pious and perhaps chaste king, which presents a problem in a moment. 1066 brings us, right, the Battle of Stamford Bridge. You'll remember we said that that Edward the Confessor rules from 1042 to 1066. In January 1066, he dies, and because of that chastity, we think, or it is reported, he leaves no direct heir to his throne. He has no kids, or at least no crownable kids that we know of. And so the question of who should receive the throne is a contested one. Coming from the northeast, right, so actually on the home team, right, elected by local English lords, we have King Harold Godwinson, right? Harold Godwinson has a pretty fair-ish claim to the throne, but not an immediately apparent one. And so a contestant coming from the northeast is King Harold Hardrada, who is coming from Norway to try to take that throne as rightfully his, and thus reestablish a kind of Scandinavian empire. That fight reaches its height at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, which brings to an effective end those Scandinavian incursions onto English land. King Harold Godwinson and his forces defeat King Harold Hardrada and his forces so decisively that pretty much at this point, this is the end of that long period of Viking raids that so influenced the continual input of Scandinavian as a force on Old English. But while King Harold Godwinson was able to hold the throne against the Scandinavian invaders, he didn't hold it, as we know, for long. An even more important thing that happens in 1066 is, of course, the Battle of Hastings, which sets off the Norman conquest, right? On Christmas Day, after William of Normandy, that is, William the Conqueror, fights and kills Harold Godwinson, right, himself taking the throne, on Christmas Day, William of Normandy is crowned King of England, of all of what is now known as England, which is not the same as Great Britain, of course, and as well as parts of France that he already held, including Normandy. When he does so, being William the Conqueror, William sees about the killing of most of the then-standing English nobility, that is, the then-standing English-speaking nobility, and replaces them with Normans. Viking attacks, as we've said, have waned and then ceased, and this marks the beginning of the Anglo-Norman period, in which the primary language of literature and law in England is a dialect of French. The acrolect of England is French, a French which becomes quite distinct from Parisian French. We call it Anglo-Norman French. This is incredibly important. It's important to remember that this watershed moment marks the beginning of the Anglo-Norman period, and thus the beginning of the early Middle English period. We say in Middle English for this reason sets in about a generation later in 1100. The form of English changes forever, and English remains spoken in England, just not at the acrolectal level. At the acrolectal level, we have, of course, Latin and French, right, at the high prestige level at least, but English persists as a baselect during this period. When you're looking at present-day English, still a rule of thumb, if you find a familiar, everyday English word, particularly any words associated with power or high culture, that has a cognate in modern French, courage, or just looks French, right? Mancien, right? Mansion, courage. That is a word that probably, forgive my terrible accent, that word, right? Courage, mansion, chair, beef, right? That word probably entered the English language between 1100 and 1350. That is the Middle English period prior to the reemergence of English into the acrolectal level in the 1350s and later. Again, 1066, the Battle of Hastings, in which we witness French-speaking invaders setting up now their homes permanently across most areas inhabited by English speakers. This initiates, I would argue, right, this permanent settlement of this conquering of the English-speaking land by a new top 10% of people who are French speakers, initiates what I have been arguing all term is a gradual creolization of the two languages at lexical, morphological, syntactic, and phonological levels. So keep in mind, we see the remnants of that both in the very shape of the language we speak, which is so influenced by Middle English, right, and in French borrowings that happen at such a high rate during this period. So that is 1066, the Battle of Hastings, which initiates the Norman conquest, and thus the Anglo-Norman and Middle English period. Somewhat after that, we have in 1169, English nobles settling in the Pale. Now this is when colonists under King Henry I, right, are coming into Ireland. You'll see here, of course, I have located this properly on the map, right? This is something that's covered in your Hickey reading, right? Way back, actually. You read this during the early modern readings, but he goes both into early modern and medieval history. And covering it here is important, right? We've already covered this, but many classes ago. This is where English nobles are settling in the Pale in Ireland. That is the area immediately around Dublin. Right, they set up permanent settlements there, and they are English speakers, but they're also Anglo-Norman speakers. And what's important to understand about this is that English does not become a superstrate, right? Even though we have English colonization of non-English speakers. Here we have Ireland, which is generally inhabited by speakers of a Celtic language, of Irish, who have English nobles from England, coming in and somewhat forcibly setting up permanent settlements there, colonizing. But linguistically, we do not see English here emerge as a superstrate, as a colonizing acrolect, even in the Pale. The reasons why? Well, for one, the rural areas are left untouched. Those who settle in the Pale remain in the Pale. They don't tend to go far outside it until the 16th century. Another reason is pre-Tudor noble politics, which essentially leads to that practice. The fact is, without the consolidations of English power that the early modern Tudors initiated, the colonizing tendency of English speakers had not yet been established. They set up their places, they kept them. And when I say colonizing tendencies, I mean the sort of greedy, what's the word? Copia and amplificatio, oriented like more tendency toward colonization. And indeed, the main reason why these nobles do not establish English as the colonizing acrolect, or the colonizing superstrate, better to say, is because of Norman ascendancy. The fact is that the English is not, at this point, in 1169, is not an acrolect. It has no acrolectic value. Yes, these nobles who are settling here, they probably speak English at home, right? And probably at this point, or at least their families do. Right? Their kids might grow up speaking English with respect to a mother tongue. But in any official capacity, in any colonizing capacity, all of their documentation that isn't done in Latin is going to be done in Anglo-Norman French, because this is still within the Anglo-Norman period, the early Middle English period. Yet they come in and they do bring English with them, which is evidenced by examples of early Irish English varieties, such as the Kildare poems, which we even see pronunciations demonstrated there, which are even reflected in some Shakespeare plays, which we talked about in those lectures. So that begins in 1169. All right. 1215, not too long after that, we have the Magna Carta. As we said about the Magna Carta is not itself particularly influential on the development of English, but it is representative of the state of things in the 13th century. Right here we have now, we're moving into the we're moving centuries later than the Norman conquest, right? A century and a half later than the Norman conquest. And we have an England at the time of the Magna Carta that is essentially trilingual, right? I'll just read you the information here, right? The Magna Carta is written first in Latin. It is then soon translated into Anglo-Norman French. And if the experts are correct, we believe that then it would be announced locally in the places where it was announced locally, orally, in English. While the document itself has no direct influence on the development of the language, I take the Magna Carta and its year as representative both of England's trilingualism, right? The acrolects are closest to Latin and French, but the baselect is English, right? During the period between 1100 and 1350, right? The pre-reemergence period. And representative of the growing popular discontent with the French-speaking ruling class, also spurned on by King John's major loss at Normandy in 1204. All right, moving forward in history. Speaking of discontent with French holdings, eventually England starts to come into its own in a really strong way. And what is England coming into its own going to do except try to claim more land, and in fact claim land back from France? In fact, the nobles are now so intermarried with people who are descended from French people that they have as much of a claim to French ownership and the French throne as any French monarch does. This sets off the 100 Years' War. And indeed, you'll see the 100 Years' War continues for more than 100 years. We can get into some of the history of that in a separate conversation, but the linguistic effects here are important, right? The linguistic effects of the 100 Years' War, right, goes across more than a century, making a series of invasions into France. As a result, right, the French language in England starts to change its status. Right? The French language becomes at once less and more a matter of pride in England. It's important that the nobles still speak French because that is part of the source, culturally, of their claim to ownership of French lands. But the French are also pushing back. The French are the enemy. And because of that, English as its own language begins to emerge as a kind of patriotic, national language of England on its own steam. Backing that up more is the emergence after the Black Plague, which makes peasant classes more powerful, the emergence of the voice of commoners as an influential one. Remember that during this period, the lowest classes, baselect-speaking classes, are still speaking English anyway, during the whole Middle English period, during the whole history of English. But it is the events of the 1380s that make those voices more prominent. We'll remember that John Ball, and this is an important thing, John Ball says, look, when Adam delved and Eve spun, who was then a gentleman? He doesn't exactly say that, though. He says, when Adam delf and Eve span, who was then a gentleman? Notice that while we would say the past tense of delve is delved, we would make it a weak verb. The verb had not yet undergone that weakening. We see this strong verb persistent well after the Old English period, the past tense of delve as dalf. But anyway, John Ball says, when Adam delf and Eve span, who was then a gentleman? He was inspired, among other things, by the story of Piers Plowman, the idea that plowmen, people who work the land, are more like Christ. And with that behind him, he is one of the leaders of a peasants' revolt. Because of that revolt, that growing discontent that continued to grow with the French-speaking leadership, we have both the peasants, not quite systematic, but the peasants' sort of overarching destruction of records that are written about them in languages they don't understand, particularly Latin, and we have a new taking seriously of English at that level. So you see on two prongs here, right, coming toward the end of the 14th century, we have English beginning to come into its own in a way that is taken seriously in public discourse, because it is the voice of the commoners and because it is the voice of those who are fighting on the home team in the 100 Years' War, right? Notably then in 1385, it's no coincidence that English starts being used at universities. This is representative of what Smith and Kim and others call the reemergence of English during the Middle English period, a reemergence that we remind ourselves is not a reemergence at all, but rather a reemergence of what had previously been a truly basolectal language, a basolectal variety, into acrolectal uses, into prestige discourse, into literary and even official documentation. This creates a boom in the way English circulates in writing. And we have witnesses to that late Middle English, that post-reemergence Middle English from all over the island. Indeed, it's mostly those post-reemergence witnesses to how English is spoken on various places in the island that inspires the work of Angus MacIntosh and those who worked with him to establish the differences among Middle English varieties. Perhaps closest to the peasants rebelling is the text Piers Plowman, which is taken as sort of an inspiration to the rebelling peasants. But Piers Plowman, we'll see, is written in a specific variety that identifies it as a West Midlands variety of Middle English. We will see in texts like Piers Plowman and other texts that are West Midlands in their variety. This is later Middle English. This is English that is written and spoken in the 1350s and later. Let's give that as a broad date. Really in the 1380s and later, up to the end of the Middle English period. It is less than half of what we call the Middle English period, but it is often most prominent in discussion because it is when English reemerges into the literature and official documentation that we tend to study at the scholarly level. So we see West Midland Middle English, whose salient features have the spellings of words like should and shall, generally with sounds that with the S and H, which represents the sh sound, as I would pronounce them. But unlike how I would pronounce, we see that generally West Midland Middle English tends to use ben for the third-person plural version of the verb to be, rather than are, as I would say. We see that the third-person plural pronouns in West Midlands Middle English is they, but hem and hira, where I would say them and their. And distinctive for West Midlands Middle English, we have where I would sometimes use s. We see West Midlands Middle English making it z or even tz. These are all salient features to us among many of West Midlands Middle English. You can see far more at the electronic atlas of later Middle English, or sorry, of Middle English online, ELAUM, right? Okay, so let's move from there to look at the other varieties. And you'll remember this is quite a busy map now. We have played around on this map so much, even into Ireland, and you remember you looked at many examples, if briefly, of various varieties of Middle English. Let's not go over all of those examples, though we did play through them, but let's just look at the salient features of each variety, right? So one of them you looked at maybe was Nicholas Love's Mirror of the Blessed Life of Christ. This is an example of Northern Middle English. You'd be able to recognize Northern Middle English texts, and again, this is primarily after the reemergence, by the following salient features, right? You can get should in Northern Middle English, but you can often get should, right? And remember, phonology and graphics are directly aligned here for all of the reasons we've been discussing all term. We don't have the emergence of print, which begins to divorce phonology from graphics. So the only witness we have to phonology in the period is the way things are spelled, and it is a pretty reliable witness. So Northern Middle English has a salient feature. It accepts should, but it also accepts should and sal, where I would say should and shall, right? Northern Middle English very strongly has are, as I do, right? Or versions of are, as the third person version of the verb to be, right? They are, not they been, right? So we see the verb are truly as a salient feature of Northern Middle English. Of course, now it's a feature of all standard Englishes, but during the later Middle English period, it is a salient feature specifically to the North. Similarly, again familiar to us, the third person singular, rather than being represented with th, as in he, all the verbs he readeth, let's say, right? So instead of readeth, in the North you might get he reads, which is again a usage familiar to us, but in later Middle English it is a usage salient specifically to the North. And of course, as we've already touched on, they, them, their. Because of that Old Norse influence, because of that Scandinavian influence, the North is the place where they, them, their, the pronouns that are still currently used in standard Englishes now for the third person plural pronoun and sometimes the third person singular pronoun, are salient features of Northern Middle English. You see forms that start with a h sound rather than a the sound everywhere else in England, though sometimes there's a variation, right? But certainly them and their rather than hem and hira is a really specifically Northern Middle English thing. You'll also see and ond as endings that can be variants on what we would say with words as ing, right? So swimming as opposed to swimand or swimond, praying or sprayand, prayond. You'll see the and on versions primarily in the North. They're more common in the North than ing. So those are salient features of Northern Middle English. What about the East? I almost said West, right? You remember we looked at the book of Marjorie Kemp as representative of East Midlands. Now you see the East Midlands, like the West Midlands, has they, but tends more toward hem and hira, whereas Northern Middle English is they, them, their, they, them, their, right? Here it's they sometimes, but hem and hira. East Middle English also has and on, but it has them interchangeably with ing. And it can use are or it can use ben. So this would make East Midlands Middle English seem like the sort of midway point. And it makes sense because the East Midlands were squarely within the Danelaw earlier. So there's also strong Scandinavian influence here, just not as strong as in the North, right? But what makes East Midlands Middle English truly distinctive, at least to me, is one particular salient feature where we see not only the should and shall that we would expect, but should, shall, represented with an X graphically. This is something we pretty much only see in the East Midlands, and you can identify an East Midlands text if you see one of those X spellings of one of those modal auxiliaries, like should or shall. Should, shall. The exact pronunciation of it probably varied from speaker to speaker and from locale to locale, but we see the X as the standard representation of a sound that seems to differ from should. All right. I think I'm talking fast again. I'll try to slow down. Here we are. All right. Moving from there to the South. Now, you'll remember here that I'm drawing on the work of Angus MacIntosh and those who came after him, and Angus MacIntosh identifies and his fellow linguists identify 5 different varieties for Middle English. So Southern and Kentish are separate ones, but for this class I'm bringing them together, right? Salient features in Southern Kentish Middle English, we see only should, not should or sud. We see pretty restrictively only ben instead of are. That's the opposite of the North, understandably. So we very rarely get the third person plural verb to be of are. It's more frequently ben. We get they, but we also get hie, right, hanging on from Old English, the hie forms, as well as hem and hira. The most common third person singular is th. So we have readeth, prayeth, rather than reads, prays in Southern Kentish. And it's more common to see ing than and. So in a lot of ways we see some mirror images of Northern Middle English, right? But Southern Middle English gives us sh and should, ben, hem, hira, and either he or hie or they. The third person singular, th, as in prayeth, and more commonly ing than and or ont. Okay. But you'll remember, by the way, sorry, before I get to Caxton, you'll remember that in distinctively Southern, or really distinctively Kentish writer, Chaucer himself, he, oh my goodness, you see, this is what I get for going off my plan. And it's Chaucer himself, he does take on some of those Northern isms when he is making fun of or taking on the voice of Northerners when he's writing a story or composing a poem in which Northern speakers are speaking. And we remember this from his Reeves Tale. All right, sorry to go off script. I just see Chaucer there and I have to go for it. Okay, so the reemergence of English into acrolectal and literary forms happens in the late 14th century. We could call the onset the 1350s, as Smith and Kim do, but we really see it picking up in the 1380s with Chaucer and Gower and all of the other Langland, right? So it's not just Southerners and Kentish writers, it's also Western writers. Langland, we have Rolla in the north, he's happening later as well. though a bit earlier. Anyway, in the late 1400s, in the late 1300s, the 14th century, we have this reemergence of English at the acrolectal level in a really prominent way. And that continues for a century and change. And then print happens, right? The first book is printed in London, very important date, 1476, and Caxton is the printer. Because the first book is printed in London, we see in general that the Southern and Kentish versions of Middle English, that is, the more southern forms, become the standard of print for the most part. It is why, in short, right? It is why, in short, Chaucer's writing is so much easier for you to read than Kemp's or Trevise's or Rolla's, right? Because print standards take on Southern forms, we find that Southern writers are easier for us now to understand, right? But when Caxton establishes his standards for his press, which he's thinking of as standards for his press, not standards across the globe of English speakers. There are no global English speakers. It's really just insular. It's just the island right now still. But when Caxton does so, he decides to draw specifically on Chancery English. That is a house style of spelling and grammatical forms, lexical usage, and idiom that characterized the papers coming out of many of the royal offices in London, which is taught to royal scribes from roughly the 1380s to the 1450s. Since royal scribes came to London from all over England, Chancery standard forms actually started to include some non-Kentish features, including the northern s, them, and r, that is, those northern salient forms that seem to us actually more like what's familiar to us. So, that passage through Chancery is very important for the development of print, because what Caxton uses as his press standard ends up establishing the norm for what will become standard global in supranational Englishes later. I'm just going to read this. Also, it's important, right, because it was taught in offices for royal administrative letter writing, in which complex issues needed to be settled in quickly read sentences, Chancery English also favored consistency in syntax that was not seen elsewhere, right? It's here that SVO becomes standard. It is here that hypotaxis comes into heavy use. Chancery doesn't expect these to be global standards, right? But Caxton picks them up and makes them global, and then early modern reformers make Caxton's English standard. This brings us roughly to the end of the Middle English period. And thus, it is in the Middle English period that we see no real standard spellings for anything. Before Caxton brings print in and print culture sets in the subsequent centuries, we get the idea that there is one frozen correct way to spell a word, one particular correct standard way for English to work. This is essentially an invention of the early modern period. While Middle English writers and Old English writers had senses of what was correct and what was standard, those were always localized. Indeed, they were sometimes localized to single writers. And so we don't have any enforced or received standards that cover all English speakers until the period after Caxton, what we call the early modern English period. That's why the Middle English Dictionary is so important, because the Middle English Dictionary has to be searched across multiple spellings. Thus, when we search in the Middle English Dictionary, we have to search for the head word with alternate spellings. And that will get us through the wide variety of ways that words can be spelled, and spelled correctly, right? Perceived as completely correct, even if you have an author like Chaucer spelling a word differently 2 times within the same sentence. This is completely acceptable in Middle English, right? Because the correct spelling is what that individual speaker sees as an adequate representation of what that speaker hears and says. From the Middle English Dictionary, we might also get a set of common words to know, and these are words that it would continue to behoove you to know for the future and for the take-home test. Make sure you know the words full as an adverb, soth, mickle, mod, lath and leovan, right? Notice leovan. Bota versus bota, right? These are pronounced and often spelled the same, but they can mean different things. Variants on spellings of and on meanings of and. On spellings of that is before, sithen, eak or eka, the source of our word nickname, swa. And swa is an Old English usage that continues primarily in Northern usages, as we'll remember from Chaucer's mocking of Northern students. The verbs don, gan, and feran. the clitic constructions of newas to nas and newalda to nalda, right? The preclitics. And importantly, the word castle, which is one I wanted you to keep in mind. Remember that castle is particularly Middle English. It enters English twice, but the first usage is rarer and doesn't mean what we mean when we say castle. When we see castle used to mean what we now mean as castle, we have that entering English only as a French borrowing after 1066. The presence of the word castle in a passage then identifies it quite effectively as an example of it can be very early Middle English, but if you see castle in a passage, you're probably looking at something that happened after the conquest, because indeed the conquest of the French aquelectal speakers of the island of Britain was often enacted in the building of multiple castles across England. While we're at it, and while we're here, there are also two other sources, or two other online tools that we introduced in this course. I've already mentioned the ELALM, right, the electronic version of the Linguistic Atlas of Late Medieval English. Remember that that's late medieval English. Generally, we say that to mean English after the reemergence, right? So 1350s and on. And to break down the remarkable dialectal variation of Englishes in that period, we have these very fascinating maps on ELALM. Make sure you at least know what ELALM is in the future, and do poke around the website. It's a good thing to know how to use. And of course, a present-day equivalent to ELALM is eWave, the Electronic World Atlas of Varieties of English, which is a website I hope by now that you are familiar with and conversant in. You should know what it is and how it works before you leave this class. Speaking of things you should know, and we're getting back into charts here, IPA, our old friends. This was one of the first things I introduced you in this class. And you've now seen how vital it was that we know what these terms mean, because we use these terms in writing when we're reading to talk about how sounds change, particularly in periods where, because spelling is so variable, while spelling is a witness to phonology, it also is a partial witness, and things are always spelled the way that given speaker understands them to be heard. And that fit is not always perfect, not at all. And not only that, but Middle English writers will often represent the same set of sounds with different letters depending on the writer. We need some way of talking about all of these shifts in phonology in a way that is separate from our standard graphic representations. And that's what IPA gives us. And you'll remember that I asked you for the week 2 quiz to understand what all of these symbols, what sounds all of these symbols represent. That's something I want you to retain, and I hope you have retained through the case study, as well as, of course, the sounds that represent the sounds that have since fallen out of spoken English, particularly the allophones and as well as, if you wish, the voiced alveolar r, which we hear in my reading of Chaucer. Chaucer's the first 18 lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. By the way, that's an important fact about Caxton's printing. His printing of the Canterbury Tales was which you picked through. You picked through some of his printings of the Canterbury Tales as a reading, was one of his first printings from his press. It was one of the things that establishes Chaucer as part of an English canon of texts. Anyway, these symbols, you already have learned them, you should retain them, and you should have them even after we leave our class. They're important and they help us hear distinctions both historically and presently. For instance, it is such terms that allow us to understand what we mean when we talk about the development from after 1100 to 1500, spurred on by a number of factors, including the Norman conquest, of phonemic voicing of fricatives. That is, the ability of English speakers that develops across the Middle English period to use the difference between v and f, z and s, and th and th, right? The voiced and voiceless pairs of those fricatives to make those phonemic, to allow us to establish the difference between house and house, between teeth and teeth. Often that distinction is used for noun-verb contrasts. In the opposite process, we also see that during the Middle English period, the phonemic vowel length and phonemic consonant length that was typical of Old English disappears decisively and early on during this period. That is, the separation of god from god. I haven't changed anything except how long I hold that vowel. Those two words in Old English mean different things. God means the equivalent of modern-day God. God means the equivalent of modern-day good. Vowel shifting has occurred since then, and we represent them differently in graphics. We have a double O, where Old English simply had a longer held vowel. We also see the falling away of final B after M, and importantly, final B after M. And importantly, during the Middle English period, the consonant clusters that were common, so common in Old English, of r and n, reducing to r and n. So the heoven to chrofa in Cadman's hymn, chrova, better to say, the roof becomes roof rather than chrof, right? Chnail becomes nail. To summarize, most known Old English varieties before 1100 have phonemic consonant and vowel length, but not a phonemic distinction between voiced and voiceless fricatives. The voiced versions were used, just they were the ones used between vowels and voiced consonants. So, wife, wives, it's a slightly different pronunciation of what is received as the same consonant, the same sound. They're allophones, right? F and v here are allophones. In addition to its lack of silent letters, like Middle English, Old English retains hr and hn clusters for words that we now pronounce with only r and n, roof and nail. It even pronounces the b in lamb, right? And importantly, I wanted to point out here that one of the things we did in sort of offering a corrective to Smith and Kim was to take out what they categorized as Old English versus Middle English and categorize things as things that aspects or features that are reliably present before 1100, then are falling out of use 1100 to 1500, that are coming into use 1100 to 1500, and reliably present after 1500. By the way, while we're zoomed in here, remember we have those dots over C's only in present-day English editions of Old English to represent the way that Old English pronounces certain C's as ch and certain G's as y. Similarly, during the period 1500 to 1800, this is what falls out of Middle English, we have a number of changes. We have the beginning of non-rhoticism. We have those post-vocalic allophones and disappearing, though they are retained in Scots dialects, right? We have the continued loss of phonemic distinctions between whip and whip. In graphics, we have the disappearance of nasal abbreviations, that's already covered on the graphics slide. And importantly, and this is important, right, we have in the late 17th century the gradual reduction of kn and gn, as in knight and gnat, or knie, reducing to n. Now we say night, nat, like the bug, nat, knee, like the part of my body, right, in the late 17th century. All of these are important because each of these cases, non-rhoticism, the reduction of silent K's and silent G's, etc., right? The disappearance of these post-vocalic allophones, but retaining them as GH. In each of these cases, we have what's called silent letters. Silent letters do not happen in Middle English. Indeed, we would say most known Middle English varieties, that is, varieties spoken before 1500, have post-vocalic h and h, which are allophones in words like knicht and lach. That's why they're spelled that way. Middle English varieties are fully rhotic. They pronounce all their R's. In fact, there are no silent letters at all, including kn and gn, except sometimes where final E is optional, final E. There is no zh sound at all, except in French borrowings. Words like vision are pre-assimilation. They're pronounced vision. Hua and wa are phonemic, and we'll remember Middle English has no its, retains a TV distinction, that is, thou versus you, and comparatively restricted hypotaxis and fewer auxiliary constructions. What do we mean by assimilation? Let's remind ourselves that palatal assimilation happens after 1500, right, during the early modern period, where early words that have sia, zia, tia, and dia, as nation, seizure, creature, soldier, start to assimilate to palatal sounds. We get the development of nation, seizure, creature, soldier. And indeed, in words like seizure, again, we get the sound zh as phonemic in English, except in French loanwords, for the first time. Again, just as a reminder, you can only understand what most of those symbols represent because you practiced your IPA way early on. And finally, our dear Giancarlo, which introduced us not only to consonant shifts, but vowel shifts. This is one of the best ways we can understand how Middle English was pronounced phonologically, because at the beginning of this chart, we have what we call the consonantal values of Middle English that teach us that the words we now say as name, see, actually I'll point to this side, the words we now say after 1850 as name, that's a diphthong, see, time, another diphthong, boat, that's a diphthong, right? Boot and foul. Notice the diphthongizations that happen here, right? Those words in Middle English before 1350, we pronounce those as nam, se, team, bought, boat, right? Bought, boat, fool. Notice all of these are monophthongs. They are pure monophthongs. They are not diphthongized yet. And as Giancarlo reminds us that the supposed great vowel shift of all of these changes happening at the same time, the changes are actually gradual and disconnected from each other. And I asked you to commit to memory specifically those consonantal values as representative of how English vowels are pronounced in the Middle English period, right? Before 1400, before 1350, really. And these two lines, name and time, so that we follow how name begins as nam, 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 nam. Then after 1450 becomes nam, nam, nam. Here we have that Shakespearean English, right? The way David Crystal and his son pronounce it would be nam, Shakespeare's period. Then after 1600 to 1700, we have a transition from nam to nem, nem to nem, nem. Name. Notice that's similar to what we might hear in Jamaican English. Think about the year that Jamaica is settled by English speakers. Name, name, and finally only after 1850 is the shift complete to name. The diphthongization becomes permanent. Time. We get team, 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 and team stays constant into the early modern English period, while words like see had already transitioned, or boat had already transitioned before the early modern period happened, right? But anyway, team, team, team. In 1550, team becomes time, time. We get an earlier diphthongization here, and that is how, say, David Crystal and Ben Crystal would pronounce it, time, time, right? Time becomes time, and remains so by 1750. And notice here too, there's no red arrow, but it's important because look at foul, fool, fool. It stays that way, fool. Remember, if you look at, say, the verb see, right? It starts as say, but then say becomes see before 1450, right? So that's not a shift that happens in the early modern period at all. But foul, fool, fool, fool. By 1550, fool becomes fool, right? Or fool, fool. House, hus, 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 house, fool, house, fool. And then by 1750, those become house, foul. Now wait a minute, they don't become that for everybody. As many Canadian English speakers know, that change does not happen globally. In fact, few of these changes happen entirely globally. We see in the multiple Englishes model a way of messing with the very idea of the great vowel shift at the tail end, as much as a closer study of actual pronunciations of varieties at the beginning end of vowel shifts completely obliterates our ability to take the GVS, the great vowel shift, for granted. Seth Lehrer reminds us, by the middle of the 16th century, English writing had effectively divorced itself from speech. Again, that's why spelling is not reflective of these shifts after the advent of print. So how does that manifest in our examples of what Old English and Middle English actually look like? We've actually looked at a great number of examples of various varieties of both. We looked at the riddle And I'm just going to show you examples of each of these before I close this second review. Right? You'll remember we looked at the riddle. This is an example of what English looked like at circa 970. Ratlich hongath bewares theo, freyan under sheata, foran is thirul. Notice those thorns and evs. Be stith und herd. Right? What English looked like in circa 1014. And look at Wulfstan's typical parataxis in style, right? He says, here are murderers and the killers of kinsmen and the killers of priests and the persecutors of monasteries. And here are perjurers and murderers. And here are harlots and child killers and many foul adulterous fornicators. And here are witches and sorceresses. You'll notice here, right, his sentence structure is typical of Old English writing in that it is paratactic. These sentences are not syntactically complex. That doesn't make them any less thoughtful or any less powerful. But parataxis is generally the rule for earlier Englishes. Later Englishes become more hypotactic. And the Old English version of that are Her sindan, I'll jump down. Her sindan manslagen and meeslagen and masserbanan and minsterhatan. And her sindan mansworen and morderwichten, and her sindan miltestran and bearnmirthan, and fule forlegene horinges maninge, etc. That's what English looks like, circa 1014. We cross the 1066 barrier into 1137, some generations after 1066, and we find an English that is technically Middle English, but that still looks quite similar. Tha the King Stephen to Anglalund come, the market he his gathering at Oxenford, and there he nam took the bishop Roger Cerebery, etc., etc. This looks very Old English still. But look, alle he waren for swearen, and her treoth is forloren for every rich man his castless markete, and against him hailden. You can even see that word castles sort of looks different than all the other words around it. Here it is a pretty recent French borrowing. And indeed, it's the presence of words like castles, let alone the word tenserie, which comes in later, right? He lad and galdis on the tuna avre umwil and klepet in tenserie, right? The intrusion, we can feel the intrusion in this very violent passage, this passage that talks about how cruel the French-speaking nobles could be to the Basilic-speaking English people, right? In their true oppression of those peoples, right? We see here the intrusion of French words as instruments of power, castle being one of the most notable ones that really marks a shift here visibly in otherwise similar varieties from Old English to post-conquest Middle English. And then what does English look like in, say, 1225 to 1240? Remember this? Lo her a jens reatha many monig remedies, froveren a mucha flok an mitsliche boten. Jef me missaith the, jef me missaith the, think that tu art eorth. Jef me missaith the, think that tu art eorth. Ne totres me earth, ne bispit me eorth. And further on, think yet on other half, what is word but wind. We see two things happening here, right? In this early Middle English, we see still strong similarities to the earlier forms. The change is gradual, but we see also more similarity to English that we might now recognize in spellings and pronunciations that emerge, that are more clearly witnessed after the reemergence. This is Middle English before the reemergence, but it's still more understandable than something that came earlier. If we look at circa 1275, a bit later, we see one example that's even clearer. As ecom be anwe. By the way, that one was, going back, I forgot to name the text. This is Ancrina Wissa, 1225 to 1240. We see here Dame Sirith, circa 1275. As ecom be anwe, hof on ich heard say, full modimon and prode, wees he wears of Laura, and gutlich under Gora, and clothed in fair shroud. Right, this is before the reemergence. It's not a prestigious, by any means, play, but it's starting to look even more like what we might have recognized in Middle English reading from other classes. And so when we get to Chaucer and Rolla and Langland, we see now post-reemergence or during reemergence English become a bit easier for us to read in the present day, right? In this work, this is the northern work of Rolla. In this work, is sek na strange English, but lichtest and commonest and swilk, that is must, lik till the Latin. Now notice Rolla registers must, where we would say must. That's a northernism too. Swa, that they knowes noch Latin by the English may come till many Latin words, etc. That is Middle English during and after the reemergence, English just before 1400. And finally, we have English just before 1500, the final period, of which we would include Caxton, right? We remember that he still is using, even in print, he's still using these nasal abbreviations. So, and ancient English for AU Macron, CYENT for ancient, right? We see that in Caxton. We see our old friend, our much beloved, we see our much beloved A Talk of 10 Wives, right? This is late 15th century. The sixth wife, Hichta Sara, she said, "Me husband is wara, is of good asses. He is wheat as any milka," notice the hua, "he is soft as any silka, yet certis he may not risa." And so we see then the passage after Caxton, after print, into English that has been printed for a long time, what we call early modern English. Examples of which we looked at in, say, this bit of an early printing of 1598 printing of Shakespeare. Here, Shakespeare is taking on the voice of a pedant, somebody who is using so many inkhorn terms that it's silly. And notably, we identified that Holofernes, the pedant's use of these inkhorn words, marks him as a user in the 1590s of buzzwords, of words that sound to us very official and fancy, and indeed were meant to sound official and fancy, as inkhorn terms were, but they're official and fancy in a newfangled kind of silly buzzwordy way that makes Holofernes' learning look as hollow as the satire is meant to paint him. So here's an example of early modern English that we looked at. We'll see here that the long S's are still in use, but we don't see any of the markers of graphic or pronunciation of English prior to 1500, because now we have passed into the early modern period. And thus there are more dates for us to think about, right? Part of what the early modern period was defined by was a sense of copia and amplificatio, right? To zoom in here, copia and amplificatio, the idea that bigger is better. The period of empire, added to the emergence of print culture, added to ongoing language change, created two distinct threads that sort of define linguistic change in the early modern period. The emergence of grammarian and lexicographic control, on which more in a moment, the idea that since English is expanding, we need systems to control it, to make it make sense, and the ideas of copia and amplificatio, the ideas that bigger is better, a kind of fundamental cultural gluttony or greediness that we see evidenced here. And nowhere is there a better onset date for that period, I would say, than the year 1588. Notice that it's only a century after Caxton, or a little more than a century, after Caxton brings the printing press. So in 1476, we have the printing press. 1588, a little more than a century later, England defeats the Armada. In the intervening century, thanks to the leadership of the Tudor rulers such as Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, we see England emerging into its own, not only as a self-conscious nation with its own language, positioning itself as its own thing, breaking away from the Catholic Church, having its own church and its own language at the center of its own map. But we see the emergent colonialism as typical of the same sense of amplificatio and copia, taking more, bigger is better, as we see in the continual invention of new words, the taking of those new words both from Latin and from the colonies that it is increasingly occupying. To quote Seth Lehrer, English at this time in effect defines itself as a word language. We see remarkable increase in lexicon here. and the business of much 16th and 17th century scholarship becomes the business of defining. Dictionaries emerge as guides to this new lexical landscape, as if language were a brave new world akin to that of the explorers or the colonists. And we see that metaphor of language growth related to colonial growth or trade growth repeated here and in the study of Eulen Burnell's Lexicon of the East India Company. Speaking of which, right, here we have the foundation of the British East India Company soon after 1588, right, just when 1588, actually I should go back and say the importance of 1588 specifically establishes England as a true global naval power. England's navy defeats the Spanish Armada, which to that point had really been the major player in terms of global sea power coming out of Europe. Here, England defeats the Armada with its own navy, setting off a true global period in the history of English. Notably here in 1600 already, we have the foundation of the British East India Company. It gains colonial control in Mumbai in 1661, but we can set 1600 as the onset date, right, well in the early modern period, as the onset date of what we now call Indian English. We discussed how Indian English, reading here from the E-Wave, is a cover term for a number of varieties of English as a second language in India. India usually does not have English as a first language, but it is a major second language, hence it is part of what Kachru would call the outer circle. And we talk about English as a sort of blanket category for all of those. We focus specifically on salient morphosyntactic features of present-day Indian English, both as a way of understanding what in the world E-Wave is saying when it says a feature is pervasive or obligatory, etc., but also as a way of asking what the difference between bad grammar or variety in grammar might be. From there, after 1600, and our discussions of Indian English that followed, we might move to 1607, only a few years later, in which the British settlement in Jamestown, Virginia is established. This will become the first successful English-speaking colony in North America, and indeed many of our conversations naturally centered on North American Englishes, whether we were talking about the various dialectal varieties or regional varieties that are represented in our own class, cutting against the Labov drawn diagram of how Canadian English is completely homogeneous. Indeed, we've witnessed Toronto English itself as deeply diverse and variegated. But it also begins the creation of North American Englishes in the first place, including, importantly, the varieties of AAE or AAVE that we talked about at such length, here represented on E-Wave as Rural African American Vernacular English, earlier African American Vernacular English, and elsewhere Urban African American Vernacular English. We talked about the perception of whether a specifically African American or Black variety exists as a function of the position of the observer that helps us understand how the very idea of varieties is constructed. And the roots of that conversation begin at the onset of North American Englishes in 1607 with the British settlement in Jamestown. In the same year, in Ireland, we have the Flight of the Earls. This marks the acrolectal dominance of English beyond the Pale in Ireland. We're working under the leadership of the Scottish James I. You remember that one example of Scottish ascendancy during this period is the on the orthography, and here I'll just zoom to it. I can't. We have in circa 1617 Alexander Hume's Of the Orthography and Congruity of the Briton Tongue, dedicated to James I. We have the King James Bible in 1611, and in 1607, again under King James, who is not a Tudor leader himself, but he is the first Stuart leader. He is the person who takes the crown from, or receives the crown from Elizabeth, and continues the English colonial project with gusto. And here, in the same year as English speakers set up their first colony in Jamestown, Virginia, or the first permanent North American colony, we also have the flight of the Earls in Northern Ireland. What happens here is, while plantation settlements have been spreading through Ireland throughout Elizabeth's reign, indeed, Spencer's plantation, which we've read about in the Mallee, was one of those plantations. Here, with the flight of the Earls following a defeat of Irish separatists in 1601, many of the Irish leaders simply leave Ireland, leaving a vacuum that James's followers eagerly fill. This establishes now a new acrolectal dominance, not just in the Pale, but across Ireland. Ulster Scots emerges as a particular way of blending the Englishes of Ulster, that is a county in Northern Ireland, with the Scottish Englishes that have come with James's help from Scotland, thanks to the systematic oppression of Catholic native Irish by Protestant English Scots speakers. This includes the legislation against the speaking of native Irish languages, and it is why we take the onset of Irish English in many ways as we know it to happen also in the early modern period, though of course Irish English has its roots as well in 1169, as I discussed already. Moving from 1607, in 1655, again, how many of these years are so close together? The remarkably rapid spread after 1588 of colonial English, right? In 1655, we have Oliver Cromwell's troops subdue and occupy Jamaica, forcing West African slaves to work in the sugar fields there. After continual uprisings, Britain delegalizes slavery in 1834, but the habitual and economic social strata remain even when Jamaica gains independence in 1962. We talked at some length and read at some length about the Jamaican Standard Jamaican SJE, Jamaican Creole JC, and other versions of English's Jamaican patois in Jamaica that have formed with the roots in 1655 via the Irvine reading. I'll take this quote that we got from the Irvine reading currently in Jamaica to say that we will now teach the various subjects in patois because it is the only language they know is not only completely ridiculous and laughable, but also a sign of failure in our education system. Yet, at the bottom of the page, we all love patois and would never want to see it diminish or leave our shores, for it is indeed one of those things that bind us together as a people and make us quintessentially Jamaican. The question being about the status of standards versus basilex, acrolex versus basilex, and about which is more empowering for a distinct variety to exist or for it not to exist, for it to be taken seriously or not seriously as a subject of study, which is more true, inherent to the prescriptive and descriptive debates that we brought to bear on AAE as much as to Jamaican English, all of which have their roots squarely in the early modern period in the 17th century. As we learn here, it is West African slaves that are brought to work in the sugar fields of Jamaica in 1655, and indeed it is 1672 that the Royal Africa Company is chartered, which governs the British trading forts that had already been established along the West African coast throughout the 17th century. So while obviously Britain is making incursions into West Africa well before 1672, it's fair to take 1672 as a kind of official date because the Royal Africa Company gets founded here and consolidates British holdings and British colonial dominance in these locations. It also is the root of the varieties of English that we discussed, including Nigerian English and Nigerian Pidgin at length. We talked about how in these cases, throughout African Englishes, we see English arriving as a colonizing acrolect and then overpassing generations after that. And again, that arrival happens in the 1600s. Right? Overpassing generations, English becomes a symbol of power in general, imperfectly, unevenly, untethered from its association with colonial power, and thus becomes desirable to some of those seeking empowerment. It becomes the acrolect. Then, though multiple languages are recognized officially, all but one of those languages end up attached to a particular local group, with interests sometimes actively opposed to others. This happens in India with debates between Tamil and Urdu and Hindi. This happens in West Africa with debates among multiple indigenous languages, as well as in South Africa, which I'll cover in a moment. But in each of these cases, because multiple languages are recognized officially, but the only one not attached to a particular local group is English, English ends up emerging imperfectly as a quote-unquote neutral language of power, which no particular group owns or seems to own. And we witness this among other cases in Nigerian English and Nigerian Pidgin, which has its roots in 1672. After all of that spreading, we also witness that 18th century lexicography emerges. We talked about two threads that define the early modern period. One was that sense of copia and amplificatio, of more. The other was this grammarian and lexicographic tendency to try to exert control and standardization and sense over this suddenly increasing span of what English was and could be. The pinnacle of 18th century lexicography, containing about 40,000 entries and the first to use illustrative quotations from literature, thus for the first time connecting lexicography with the establishment of a literary canon, is Johnson's dictionary, from a date that you should all know really well by now because you've been typing it again and again as the password into our course website. Johnson is indeed 1755. That is when Johnson's dictionary comes out. It establishes the prescriptive influence of dictionaries as well as the range of their descriptive capacities. It is an important moment. It marks the pinnacle of much of what is going on in terms of the grammarian and lexicographic movements that define the early modern period. And, of course, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. At the same time, think about the 1700s back in North America, where the United States is declaring its independence in 1776. And duly, Noah Webster publishes his dissertations on the English language in 1789, and importantly, his American Dictionary of the English Language of 1828, which establishes, and here's this word again, establishes U.S. English as endonormative and cultivates a different look for American as opposed to British English, particularly through orthography, through the way things are spelled. Right, and Webster pushed for and advocated for a phonetic way of representing English spelling in America based on how he felt words to truly be spelled. But of course, as we learned from looking at the letter books of James Brown of Rhode Island just a bit earlier in the 18th century, there were serious variations or significant variations among the ways words were pronounced in the colonies in North America already. And so Webster is saying that he is being thoroughly descriptive in his dictionary, but in many ways he's being very prescriptive. The prescriptions of Webster and of Johnson become definitive for what we recognize now as SBE and SAE. We see here in the chart I provided you a number of ways that SBE and SAE are distinguishable from each other, most notably and most visibly the spelling, the graphics, where SBE has OUR and RE spellings for words like honor and center, whereas thanks to Webster, we get changes to OR and ER for honor and center and such words after 1800, right? That is the changes set in motion by his dissertations on the English language and his dictionaries. But you'll remember here in this chart, I lined up those two standards against Jamaican Englishes and Nigerian Englishes, both of which also have their roots in the early modern period, though they have continued, like standard Englishes, to develop since then. And we brought those together and made the case that although the early modern period, and indeed much of the present-day English period, was defined by establishing SBE and SAE as the best Englishes for a variety of reasons, specifically because of their perceived historical purity, because of their perceived efficiency, and because of their perceived logic and sense, we realized that SJE, JC, and NP actually make a lot more sense, are more efficient, and are more historically pure, notably in the retention of pure vowels where SBE and SAE diphthongize, as well as other ways than the standards that are supposedly better than them. I presented you this chart not as a way of arguing that one is better than the other, but rather as a way of messing with the a priori assumption that standards represent the height of efficiency, of clarity, of historical purity. Moving on from there into the present-day English period. And here we're actually right on the border, right? We can mark sort of the settlement of Australia and the emergence of Webster's Dictionary as the pivot point between early modern and PDE. In 1788, we have the First Fleet, the English prisoners' colony established at Botany Bay, and the roots of the Koineization, that is the remixing of multiple local varieties into a new general variety that comes to define Australian Englishes. Thus, we learned that Australian English, because it is not as regionally marked as other regional Englishes, because its Koineization mixes together more broadly all of the different local varieties of the different lower class places in England that settlers came from. Australian English's variety tends to vary more visibly along social lines, from cultivated to general to broad. This is where we got introduced to ideas of acrolectic and basolectic Englishes, the difference between ride my bicycle and ride me bike. In 1806, soon after that, we have the initiation of English in South Africa, and the South African Englishes that again are here marked by race, often black South African, white South African, Indian South African Englishes. It is in 1806 that British forces seize the Cape at the southern tip of Africa in South Africa from the Dutch, who had already occupied it. So we have a already colonized culture, right, that takes on English as L2. Free states emerge until these two fall under British dominance at the end of the century, at which point South Africa becomes a unified state. We talked about how the fact that the National Party, the movement against the National Party, against apartheid in the 20th century, led by Nelson Mandela and others, the fact that it takes English as its language, as Schneider puts it, that it takes English as its where is the quote? That it takes English as its language of liberation. There it is. There we go. The fact that Schneider takes English as the language of liberation in South Africa is one particular example of how English, because it is not attached to any particular ethnic group, because even the colonizers are more associated with Dutch and Afrikaans, English becomes this language of liberation in South Africa and becomes in many ways an emergent standard. And we talked about how in 1819 we have the settlement, actually let's do 1898 first. In 1898 we have the settlement of English speakers in the Philippines, but the settlers here, the colonizers, are Americans rather than British speakers, and so we see the roticity of American English, for instance, reflected in Philippine English, starting in 1898. And in 1819, we see the first British flag flown over what will later be called Singapore and Malaysia, thus the roots of Singaporean and Malaysian Englishes happening here. Our conversation about Singaporean Englishes, of which much has been written in the Smith and Kim, in the Smith and Kim as well as in World Englishes, brought up the question in the first place of which is more empowering, for a distinct variety to exist or for it not to exist, which is more true. Indeed, there have been movements from the top down, attempted changes from above by the Singaporean government to deny that Singlish or colloquial Singapore English even exists. As E-Wave puts it, although Singlish is challenged by the government's language policy, it is valued by its speakers as an expression of a distinct Singaporean identity. We see that as representative of the kind of prescriptive versus descriptive, the kind of word-to-world versus world-to-word fit debate that has characterized the development of present-day Englishes and global Englishes. Singapore is a kind of touch point for that kind of divide because the government is so outspoken against Singlish, indeed starting something called the Speak Good English movement in 2002. As well, in Southeastern Asia, of course, we were introduced to Thai English in the expanding circle in our examples from Dream and Tea, which showed that, in fact, global Englishes which show that in fact global Englishes, and English indeed in the present day period is truly global, having spread across the fullness of the world, including the places that were settled by English speakers only in the 19th century, in the present-day English period. We can see that these global Englishes are truly characterized by a real remixing and mixing across varieties, as Smith and Kim would argue in their case of the Thai English used by Dream, so that now the world we have of present-day English cannot be associated necessarily with one locality, but indeed shows a remarkable level of mixing and remixing and improvisation and diversity at every level. This brings us back indeed to where we started, which is of course Toronto, where we see in Toronto a remarkable variety of English. We see this kind of variety not only demonstrated in Drake's Toronto English, but indeed all of our Toronto Englishes. We've spent much of our term really digging into what English looks and sounds like in Toronto right now. And I want to close by reminding you not only that there will be questions on the take-home final drawn from the various case studies that your classmates did, but reminding you that that is truly course content, that the case studies of each other that we have are the best indicators of what English in Toronto, and indeed, since Toronto is a global city, Toronto English globally really looks and sounds and feels like right now. We are our subject. We are all the inheritors of the history of the English language. If you can understand the words I'm saying, then this history is yours. It's been a pleasure to introduce it to you and to talk through its complexities with you. I'll see you on Monday, and I hope you've enjoyed this material.